thank you so much for having me here today at this Challenge Poverty Week themed event to speak on the link between poverty and the climate crisis, and to also explore the ways that climate action and anti-poverty action intersect. My name is Chloe Campbell, and I'm the Policy and Parliamentary Officer at the Poverty Alliance. And for those who are not familiar with us, we are Scotland's anti-poverty network, and together with our members, of which there are now over 450, we influence policy and practice, we support communities to challenge poverty, we provide evidence through research and build public support for the solutions to tackle poverty. Our members include grassroots community groups, academics, large national NGOs, voluntary organisations, statutory organisations, trade unions, and faith groups. So we see every day the want across all sectors for progress towards a just and sustainable future where we all have enough to live in decency, dignity, and safety. And this one is particularly visible this week, which is Challenge Poverty Week. And I feel confident that some of you on the call are already familiar with this campaign and have been taking part. But just for general information, Challenge Poverty Week is an annual campaign coordinated by the Poverty Alliance, which represents a point in the year for civil society to come together to call for a just and equal Scotland, showcasing work that has been done throughout the year to tackle poverty, both on a local and a national level, and calling for the systems change we need to see to address the root causes of poverty. And this year's campaign policy has centre on 5 themes: housing, transport, adequate incomes, food security, and fair funding for the third sector. And I think before even unpicking the ways that poverty and the climate crisis are linked, we can see, particularly through those themes of housing, transport, and food, that these are shared policy priorities and policy areas from both climate and poverty perspectives, and something that we all know we need to see increasingly urgent action on. So today I'm going to quickly explore the links between the climate crisis and poverty, and I'm sure that most of you on this call already have some awareness and have had conversations and thoughts about this link. I'm also going to spotlight some of the outputs of the Poverty Alliance's recent work with the Scottish Government's Just Transition team, and this work gathered the views of people living on low incomes in the development of Scottish Government plans for a just transition to net zero, specifically in the context of housing and transport. And finally, I hope to highlight through our Challenge Poverty Week policy asks how in many situations the actions communities take to combat the cost of living crisis and poverty are intertwined with action we need to take on the climate emergency. I'm really sorry if you can hear any background noise, but we're in central Glasgow and I feel like everyone is emptying their glass bins at the moment. So I'm really sorry. I feel like this is the Friday morning time to do that. So yeah, just let me know if you can hear too much background noise. But before we get into all that, I just wanted to pop onto the screen one of my favourite quotes from writer and activist Mary Annie Segler, which some of you may already be familiar with. And this is a quote that I come back to a lot. Like the scale of the crisis that our climate is in, I can also feel quite overwhelmed by the scale and complexity of the poverty that we see in Scotland. And the necessary action that we need to take progress on both poverty and the climate emergency. However, I do feel like having spaces like climate hubs, this event, and Challenge Poverty Week campaign is a really powerful way to connect with others and celebrate the innovative work that is done across Scotland and foster the solidarity we need to see in creating a just and safe future that works for all people. We all know that poverty and the climate breakdown is not inevitable, so there is a role for all of us to take action and find power in creating solutions that are experience driven. And I certainly find power in being spaces like this and talking with others. So yeah, I kept this quote in mind when I was thinking about how to approach this subject today. So thinking about poverty, in our wealthy nation, it is unjust. It is simply not acceptable that so many people do not have adequate incomes to live in a decent and dignified life. 1 in 5 people in Scotland, and this rises to 1 in 4 children, are having their life chances restricted by the preventable injustice of poverty, and poverty and inequality have far-reaching negative consequences for individuals, causing severe harm to people's daily lives, damaging their health and employment prospects, risking financial and personal well-being, and infringing on fundamental human rights such as access to food and housing. The risk of poverty continues to be disproportionately high for particular groups, including disabled people, women, Black and minority ethnic people, and single parents, over 90% of whom are women. I think it's particularly important to point out that poverty in rural areas in Scotland is often hidden from policy making, particularly because policymakers and sort of general belief is that rural communities and island communities have more wealth. They do make up a smaller part of our population, and they are often an afterthought in policy making, despite the fact that challenges with our public services and the cost of living is higher in rural areas. So problems and challenges faced by those living on low incomes is often amplified for people living in rural and island communities. So patterns of poverty run through well-established channels of social injustice, and so do the impacts of the climate crisis. All impacts of the climate crisis will be felt disproportionately by those who are being made vulnerable by poverty, marginalisation, and other social injustices. And we often talk about this in the context of historically marginalised and low-income countries and communities who have contributed the least to current climate breakdown, but who are experiencing its impacts first and worst. And I think that maybe not necessarily in this climate hub environment, but just more generally in kind of wider climate discussions at national level and also at community level, we need to more regularly recognise that those communities include low-income households and communities in Scotland. Rising energy costs as a result of our reliance on fossil fuels, energy inefficient homes, and expensive and inefficient transport all add to people's poverty, whilst pouring more carbon into the atmosphere. During periods of extreme weather, those living in poverty on or low income are less able to respond to damage or loss that might be inflicted to homes and belongings. From an environmental health perspective, residing in areas close to roads is associated with residing in areas close to roads and industrial areas, which is affected by poverty and low income, is associated with greater exposure to air pollution, which in turn has head to toe harm. These are just a few examples of the way that the climate crisis and poverty are linked. And I'm sure that you can all think of many more ways that is the case, particularly as these impacts are amplified for those living in poverty in rural, coastal and island communities. If you do have any reflections on this, do pop them in the chat. I can't see the chat at this moment, but we can certainly come back to it at the end and sort of have a think about our kind of collective reflections on this. And in addition to this, the World Bank estimates that climate change will push more than 100 million people into poverty by 2030 if urgent action is not taken. And it doesn't seem that at a national level and an international level that the urgency of action is being taken. And this impact on poverty would be as a result of, for example, weakened food and social infrastructures. And I think it would be naive of us to think that none of those 100 million people would be in Scotland. So not only do the impacts of the climate crisis disproportionately impact those already living in poverty, but it could also cause further poverty if action is not taken. If we are to have a just and compassionate future, then our climate actions need to recognise that the climate crisis is a social and political problem as well as an environmental one. So our solutions to the climate crisis should be based in climate justice and seek to simultaneously address the root causes of poverty and social injustice, whilst also making progress on climate. I'll pause there just in case anybody has any questions or reflections that they want to share. If not, I'll keep going. So some of the things that I've just mentioned have emerged in our recent work with the Scottish Government's Just Transition team, which supported the engagement of a citizens panel of people living on a low income in the development of national just transition policies. And these are the policies that should support our national journey to net zero. In that work with the Just Transition team, we looked at the themes of the built environment, which mainly focused on housing and transport. And both of these citizens panel had representation from rural and urban experiences, which was really valuable because experiences of the built environment and transport do differ fairly significantly for those living in rural communities. So on the built environment, the majority of panelists did not think that their homes were healthy or warm, and that there was consensus that their homes were not energy efficient. And some panelists reported needing to wear a coat or a jacket while sitting in their home. And one panel member stated that their kitchen was so cold in the winter that they were unable to stay in there to wash the dishes. On the topic of adverse weather and increasing extreme weather in Scotland, panel said that recent storms had impacted their home and their neighbourhood in an adverse way, leading the majority to conclude that their home was not well protected from adverse weather. And we know that adverse weather is becoming more frequent in Scotland, and this is really concerning. And the issues they cited included water coming through windows and walls, front porches flooding, windows and doors not being able to secure in high winds, local footpaths and bridges flooding, creating issues in accessing essential services and transport, and drain blockages on streets. And one panelist reported water coming through their windows and walls, and they often had to wake up in the middle of the night to soak up water during periods of heavy rain. And whilst this person had repeatedly been in touch with their housing association about this, there had been nothing done to address this very long-standing issue. So there was a strong message from the panel that extreme weather should be a key factor in the design and building of new social homes, and preventing the rise of issues that many of the participants are currently experiencing. And the panel highlighted that looking at adverse weather through a poverty lens, it is those who are least able to afford it who are more likely to be disrupted and displaced by increasing extreme weather like heavy rain, and more frequent storms. There is also likely to be increased home insurance costs as a result of these issues, which people on low incomes are unable to afford. On the screen are some quotes from that citizens panel, and I think that these quotes represent one of the emerging key messages from this panel, which was that they told us that there was a sense of disparateness and deep skepticism about whether there's a genuine will for real change that would support those on low incomes to make their homes safer and more energy efficient as our climate continues to change. And I think it also represents the nature of conversations about just transition on things like housing, which do continue to exclude certain groups, and that can foster feelings of disconnect from people. Particularly as the cost of living rises and people are struggling to meet their daily needs, this climate conversation feels very disconnected from their everyday life. And this is something we are really focusing on in our work, and in our asks of the government to ensure that very important and necessary adaptations to infrastructure that would protect against increasing adverse weather, but also new technologies that would make homes more energy efficient are also made available to those living on low incomes. People cannot be priced out of living in safe, secure, and sustainable homes as we continue to see more adverse weather and impacts of changing climates on our built environment. On to our experiences heard through transport, a sustainable and viable public transport system is vital in achieving Scotland's ambitions on net zero, as well as our targets to reduce car kilometres. And this is what our citizens panel on transport unpacked. A common thread in every conversation we had across both the urban and rural groups was an emphasis on the vital importance of public transport in connecting people to employment, education, leisure and healthcare. And there was unanimous agreement that transport was a critical policy priority for people living on low incomes. The quality, reliability and affordability of public transport was on the whole considered to be inadequate. And this perception strongly influenced how people thought about other goals like reducing car usage. And the panel was pretty unanimous that significant improvements are required to public transport provision if the goals, such as the reduction of private car use, are to succeed without negatively impacting vulnerable groups. Um, and findings underscored that the cost of public transport remains the key concern for people living on low incomes. And panel members reported that this cost influenced their decision to leave the house, their employment decisions and how they spend their free time. But there were also other key messages about reliability. So public transport showing up in good condition and on time with routes that work for local people, which I know is not a reality for a lot of people in Scotland, but is particularly a reality for people living in rural areas and in island and coastal communities. And a key message that also emerged was safety concerns for women and girls, Black and minority ethnic people and disabled people, which forced their behaviour change and limited access to these services. So even when those services were in place and accessible to people, and people simply didn't feel like they could use them because they didn't feel safe. Important to note here that the panel made very clear that these issues are amplified in rural areas where transport routes are poor, if even present, and are more expensive than they are in urban areas. And for many, therefore, private car ownership was a lifeline that allowed them to be connected to jobs and essential services. But this is a very expensive lifeline that put a massive amount of pressure on their finances, particularly as the cost of fuel continues to rise. Expensive and poor public transport all across Scotland was therefore seen to be, at best, discouraging people from using public transport systems, and at worst, cutting people off from vital services. So reform to our public transport systems and making it more affordable and accessible would not only be a benefit to those living in poverty, it would also support the net zero ambitions that Scotland has of getting more people to use sustainable modes of transport. I just wanted to highlight a key message from both of those citizens panels, that there is an absolute necessity of putting people in poverty and living on a low income at the centre of planning and decision making around core just transition policy issues. And this is to ensure that initiatives are inclusive and do not leave people in poverty behind in very necessary transitions to greener infrastructures and public services. And also that services are improved so that they work for all people. We're going to keep talking, or I'm going to keep talking anyway, about the themes of housing and transport a little bit longer, as these are, as I said earlier, 2 of 5 of this year's Challenge Poverty Week asks, with the others being adequate incomes, food and fair funding for the third sector. And I'm going to try and frame anti-poverty action in these sort of anti-poverty asks that we have as climate actions, and actions in national level decision making that has an impact on climate. And I think it's important to think about this in the context of the Scottish Government's current priorities, the foremost of which is eradicating child poverty. The First Minister has made very clear that this is the sort of core priority of his government, which is something that we welcome very much. But it's important to also recognise that tackling the climate emergency is also in those priorities. So linking up poverty and climate policies and action is not only, well, we consider it not only the right thing to do, but from our perspective, it also makes strategic sense for the government to be supporting activities that work on the link between eradicating poverty and tackling the climate emergency. So on housing, this week and every week we are calling for a Scotland where we all have safe, secure and sustainable homes that meet our needs. You can see our policy asks on the screen. I don't want to read it all out just for time, but I wanted to highlight that last ask because I think it is in itself a very, very clear example of where action to decrease the climate impact of a home is also a mechanism for lowering bills and ultimately lowering the cost of living for households. And this is, I think, particularly important in the context of rising energy costs. I think it showcases the need for those who are on the lowest incomes not to be left behind on Scotland's net net zero journey through financial support from the government. And I think that this is, yeah, this is a kind of share ask that the poverty and climate spaces could have. We've also already talked a little bit about transport, and this ask builds on the outputs from our citizens panel. And we are calling for a Scotland where we can all get to where we need to go, and to get to this sort of vision that we have, we need affordable, accessible, and reliable public transport so that all of us have the same freedoms to access essential services, employment, and leisure. As I've already said, increasing the use of public transport and decreasing private car use is an important part of our journey to net zero. So we need to make sure that our public transport systems are usable for all people. Again, I highlighted that last ask because I think that, or we consider current planning structures around public transport to not really meet the needs of local people. I think that is particularly true in rural areas, but is also true in more urban areas too. And that we hear a lot that expanding concessionary bus travel or having the concessionary bus travel in places is really a powerful thing and is really transformative initiative by the Scottish Government. But when those transport links are not there, people can't use that benefit. And also, if the transport does exist for young people, they're often having to travel with people that are not eligible for concessionary travel and who still can't afford the price of a ticket to travel with those who are eligible for concessionary travel. So we really need to make sure that our public transports work for people, that they support people who are in receipt of low income and disability benefits to ensure that everyone can access it, but also making sure that our public transport routes link people up in a way that makes sense to them, and that links people up with the essential services that they need, regardless of where they live in Scotland. We have had this week, during Challenge Poverty Week, a really interesting conversation actually on Tuesday morning about the idea of community transport and the power that that could have for low-income communities living rurally in Scotland. And I think that that's also is also something that we could think about in terms of being an anti-poverty measure, and also something that could make progress towards, or that could be considered to be a climate action. And there is really good work already happening in Scotland on community transport, but it would certainly be encouraging to see the Scottish Government start to support community transport at a more national level, to ensure that they have sustainable funding. On the theme of adequate incomes, we're calling for a Scotland where we all have enough to live a decent and dignified life through the delivery of a minimum income guarantee. The minimum income guarantee is something that the Poverty Alliance talk a lot about, and I can certainly pass on more information if you're interested in this policy idea. And this is a policy idea that would set an income floor below which no one in Scotland would be allowed to fall, and that would be made up of three different sort of strands, and that would need reform to our public services to reduce the cost of living. It would take reform to the world of work to ensure that people have access to fair work opportunities that are flexible enough to meet their needs and that pay them a good wage. And it would need reform to our social security systems to make sure that they have adequacy built in, and that people who cannot have adequate enough income through public services and work are not being allowed to fall below that income floor. As you can see by our campaign policy ask on the screen, we've captured some of the social security and public service and cost of living sort of elements of a MEG, but what is not captured in these particular aspects, something that is central to the work of the Poverty Alliance day in and day out, is that necessity of fair and sustainable work opportunities. I think this connects very much to the climate emergency, and I think we can see this through the example of offshore oil and gas workers. We all know in this room that if we have a chance of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees, there needs to be a really swift and just transition away from the production and use of fossil fuels. And the Scottish Government has set a target for net zero emissions of all greenhouse gases by 2045, which is a very ambitious target. And they have, well, there's a lot of talk around those climate targets, but they are still very set on their net zero ambitions anyway, which is something that we would welcome anyway. And we know that the process of phasing out fossil fuels was always going to be difficult given Scotland's relationship to fossil fuels. And that becomes particularly complex in industrial communities and cities where the livelihoods of a significant proportion of the population are tied to polluting industries. And I think in Scotland, this is particularly true. In the northeast, with offshore oil and gas workers. So we do need that rapid transition away from oil and gas that protects those workers, communities, and also the climate. There was a really interesting study by Sheffield University that kind of exemplified why we can't repeat the mistakes that we've had in the past. And we can see that more than a third of those living in former coal mines across England, Scotland, and Wales report significant health difficulties. And 1 in 12 live on either disability, living allowance, and personal independence payments. So there is really significant social impacts in having an unjust transition away from industry and ways of earning an income. And with that being said, moving to a clean economy would create millions of jobs around the world. That, with the right training and support and opportunities, would give workers in today's high polluting industries access to those jobs. That would rely on a thoughtfully planned and executed just transition that centres on the lived experience and expertise of workers. But if this is done right, it could provide an opportunity to address existing inequalities in the labour market and within housing and other sectors to create a fairer and more equal society. For instance, improving bus links and public transport links, ensuring better quality and warmer homes are built, and expanding access to green space. And these are all aims of just transition, which would also have public health and social benefits. So again, we're seeing the link between poverty and climate action. But as is captured in this report from Friends of the Earth Scotland and Platform, there are still serious concerns from offshore workers around the implementation of a just transition. And there are frustrations and fears of many of this country's workers in the oil and gas industries, that these industries continue to prioritise profit, whilst millions of people were pushed into fuel poverty. In recent years, oil companies have seen record profits, and this report showcases that workers have low morale. They have a sense that nothing will change. There's a culture of fear in these industries, and there's an inability for them to visualize a future. And they pointed to an energy industry that is resistant to transitioning workers to secure zero carbon jobs. So I think there is a role for the climate sector and the anti-poverty sector to really put pressure on these industries, to put pressure on our national level decision makers, and to ensure that people have a just transition, people have access to fair work opportunities, and that our just transition away from oil and gas doesn't undermine people's security and safety in their jobs, that it actually gives them more safety and security in their work. On food, we're calling for a Scotland where we live without hunger through dignified access to good quality, healthy and sustainable food. And we know that climate change impacts have an impact on food supply, which in turn has an impact on food prices and food security. And I think there's there is some really good work happening across Scotland on the connection between the climate crisis and poverty. Joan and I were talking before everyone else joined the call about food forests that are being growing in local communities. And I think I used to live in Edinburgh, and Leith Community Croft was just down the road from me. And that was the community coming together to ask the council if they could take over a piece of derelict land on Leith Links. and they've turned that space into a community garden where the community has access to the food that's grown there. Young people can come and get more knowledge about growing. They use some of the produce created in their garden or grown in their garden um, to make things to sell. It's a really positive way of fostering community resilience whilst also creating some form of food security. And I think that's a really powerful way of connecting anti-poverty and climate action together at a real community level. And I know that there are countless examples of projects just like that across Scotland in both urban and rural areas. I was in Pitlochry the other week with my family because I'm originally from Perth, but I live in Glasgow now. And they have a lovely community orchard, which is just a sort of take what you need at the time space. And I think that that's just a really powerful form of community resilience and resistance, and is fostering a way food security whilst also tackling some form of stigma as well, and poverty related stigma, which I think is really powerful. And our last Challenge Poverty Week asked, which is actually the theme of today, if anyone's interested in sort of taking part in any of the events that are happening today, is it centres on valuing our community's volunteers through the introduction of fair and sustainable funding of 3 or more years for the third sector. We are very clear in our in our day-to-day work that a sustainable voluntary sector is central to the Scottish Government's core mission of eradicating child poverty, and plays a critical role in delivering the public services that provide lifelines to people living on low incomes. And I think we can say the same thing about the government's priority of tackling the climate emergency, which will take obviously national and international action, but will also depend on community level initiatives and actions, which means that grassroots organisations require and deserve sustainable financial support, and because they are experience driven, they are community need driven, they understand the experiences of their local communities and are responding to that in really creative and innovative ways. And that needs to be recognised through funding, and to stop this sort of cycle of constantly having to apply for funding, having real insecurity in organisations. And we've heard from our members that this is preventing third sector and community organisations from giving fair work opportunities to people in their local communities, particularly because some organisations don't know after 9 months if someone will have a job next year, and that sort of real lack of clarity on funding is harming so many of our vital communities and community organisations across Scotland. So I think that is sort of a shared concern across the poverty and climate sector. That is everything that I have for you today in terms of linking up our poverty work, and climate action. I would say that this is a developing sort of space of work for the Poverty Alliance. And as we move away from Challenge Poverty Week, we're really going to focus on what a just transition really means for people living in poverty all across Scotland. We have a rural specific project taking action on rural poverty, which is also known as TARP, which is maybe not a particularly good acronym, but our taking action on rural poverty projects is going to be central in our work on the just transition. They have a policy function and a research function as well. So we'll be gathering the experiences of people living in poverty on a low income in their experiences of the climate crisis, and their on what they need from a just transition, and we'll be implementing that and incorporating that into our policy asks moving forward as well. Yeah, thank you so much for allowing me to come today and share with you. If you have any questions for me, happy to take them. I'll stop sharing those so I can see everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chloe. That was really interesting, and I think really sets the scene for where we are. I think part of what I was thinking as you were going through it as well was the way that people are adversely impacted by these extreme weather events. I think that we've seen very much these extreme weather events in the news this week, not in Scotland, but in the States. And you can see very much where there's those evacuation notices and the people who weren't able to leave, basically. And we know that it's the same here. I mean, we're just waiting for when we were traveling back to on Wednesday, we kind of stopped at Gulspie, where we do a lot of work. Gulspie is a village that is very much impacted already by the changing climate and by extreme weather, but we can see it in most areas of Highland where we get that extreme weather and the impacts that go on, and that the housing isn't suitable, and we have windows that are coming in. Sorry, I have a dog who is desperate to get into this call at the same time, if you can see me. And it is, it's real issues across these rural communities. I don't know, does anybody have any questions or any points that they would like to bring in? Catherine.
Hi, thanks so much, Chloe, for this presentation. It was fascinating. I was glued to it. Thank you so much for sharing this. Really great to see. So I'm from the EAUC, the Environmental Association for Universities and Colleges. So we work with universities and colleges. I'm in the Scotland team, specifically across Scotland, to see how can we, on the one hand, improve the sustainability of estates, but also bring sustainability into learning and teaching. And we have even though we're called the Environmental Association, that's an old name. We're really about holistic sustainability, including, for example, poverty, including gender equality, other forms of equalities. So it was really great to hear a lot of the things that we think about phrased so well and in such good facts. And first of all, do you maybe have a source where a lot of the facts that you just stated would maybe be accessible in writing, because we can share those with our members and be like, look, this is how climate and poverty connects, especially in further education colleges. That's a big topic. So that would be really useful if you had something like that.
Yeah, no, certainly I can send across sort of sources for everything that I talked about in here. A lot of this stuff has come from Scottish Government sources, but I can certainly also link to some of our members' works and some of our research as well. But yeah, I'll send everything across.
That'd be great. Thank you. And then my actual proper question for you is, how do you see the role of education, specifically further and higher education, from my perspective, in addressing these interconnected challenges of poverty and climate?
But a really good question. I think that in terms of education, I guess it is making very clear that this is an interconnected issue, that the root causes of the climate crisis run through very well established social injustices, and this is a question of power. Poverty is a question of power, and so is the climate crisis. You know, people who are I mean, the whole point of that presentation was that people that are experiencing poverty and social injustice will always be disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis. And I think that that's a really important thing to connect up in knowledge sharing in those higher education spaces. And I think that certainly when I was at university, kind of student organizing was a really, really powerful way to share experiences and to share knowledge, to put pressure on our universities to, for example, divest in harmful harmful things that are harming the environment, amongst other things. So I definitely think that there's a role in organising amongst staff and students to put pressure on our universities and colleges to not only become more sustainable in their practice, to make those links really explicit in their work, but yeah, also through the knowledge that they're creating and sharing as well.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. I think there is something to a lot of what you said, and the experiences you've had with the panel as well around people who are poor not necessarily feeling like climate change is something that they can care about. And I just wonder if you could highlight again maybe some ways in that you found effective to help people understand that, while obviously, you know, we don't want to force them to care about it because they do have things to worry about, it does interconnect. And, you know, how can we address that?
I think that that's actually something that we're going to have to think about moving forward as we kind of develop our work around, particularly around just transition and the climate crisis, is how do we engage with people who are struggling to meet their basic needs day in, day out. And I think that if you think about it from a very high level, we can make those connections between, for example, rising food costs and the climate crisis, or our reliance on fossil fuels, and sort of wider social and political events, for example, war, for example, political choice and will. But when people are really struggling to meet their daily needs, it's very, very difficult to connect those issues for people. And I think that there's a real challenge for us in making those topics feel accessible to people, to connect it really with their daily lives, and I guess to put real pressure on our decision makers to include people's perspectives and experiences. But I think you're right, is that you can never kind of force people to care or be active participants in campaigning or lobbying, because people will have issues that they care more about, or they'll have issues that are more pressing to them. And it may be that people are living in poverty and low income now and are not don't have the capacity or the emotional capacity to think about these things, but actually in 2 years' time they might. So just continuing to have those conversations, I think, in a way that really stresses on those shared values of justice and compassion. We all want to live in a safe and secure world. We want to live and we want to create a safe and secure future for us all. So really thinking about how those connect, how we can connect those to people's experiences. But it's certainly something that we also need to think about as well. So I'm not sure I have I have an answer. And certainly those conversations we had with the citizens panel, we're really, really keen that people share their experiences as they experience them, and not necessarily like lobby them to care about a thing that they would not already be caring about, you know. And it just so happened that those experiences connected very much to the climate emergency. But that's a really interesting thing. I think we also need to kind of develop our understanding as well. That was a very rambling answer. I'm sorry.
No, really helpful. Thank you.
I'll just add to it as well, is that we spend a lot of time as a climate hub talking about how can we talk about climate without talking about climate, because that's not, people are interested in how they feed themselves, how they heat their homes. So hence that operating very much on the basis of what are the community needs, and then how do we address it and how do we amplify the voices, because also people talking about not being able to heat their homes, that's, you know, we need to be able to take that into what we're then lobbying for and what we're talking about and what we're trying to develop as services, which will be where the climate action comes in, but we're amplifying their voices through that. Fiona.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to that. I'm based in Sutherland. We have a lot of fuel poverty in Sutherland, with older housing stock and worse winters and very rural. But part of my role is giving out a helping hand fund to people in fuel poverty. And because it usually ramps up at winter time, and I'm sure it'll ramp up this winter, but it's been really steady over the summer because it's been such a wet summer. And I think people maybe in that situation are not realizing that there's other people in the same boat. When I'm processing all these and I can see the trends. So I think, you know, people need to see that, a pattern of that, before I think they'll come to terms with the fact that, you know, the climate is changing and they are having to have our heating on more often or change the way we use fuel. I just wanted to add in a wee bit of what I've seen on the ground.
I think that's really interesting. I think that you're right that we talk to people on a day-to-day basis who have real feelings of, I mean, poverty is so traumatic, and it makes you feel so alone and isolated, and poverty related stigma is really strong, and it can make you feel, society can make you feel like it is your fault, and actually, so applying for support can feel really difficult for people. I think our experience anyway with rural communities through our TARP project is that particularly in rural communities, there's a real stigma around sort of reaching out for support, particularly in smaller communities where, you know, the person that you might be reaching out to support to is known to you, and you're really worried about the way that that might be perceived. And that has a really strong impact in the way that people move about and getting support, despite the fact that these are failures in housing stock, political decision making that is potentially not supporting people in the way that it should. And I think that it's really interesting to hear your experience on the ground of sort of increased need, and particularly around sort of wetter summers, and how how stigma and the way that our social security systems are set up will continue to support people as and when they need it, as adverse weather continues to be a thing. Increasing adverse weather continues to be a thing.
Could I just add, part of my role will be working quite closely with public health to look at sort of green health and people with mental health issues getting into nature to support their mental health. We've been working quite closely. We've been successful with a few sort of funds from the Climate Hub to help us promote that in Sutherland, and it's something that we're working on quite closely. And public health has a lot of evidence about health and access to nature. Just if you were looking for sort of evidence-based stuff, they have, you know, about access to green spaces in Highland and how it improves heart health, and, you know, people with more access to green spaces have, you know, are so much more healthier, and the impact of COVID on people's access to the outdoors. It's really interesting. So just if you were looking for more information, that would go there.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I've only been at the Poverty Alliance for 6 months, and before I was at Scottish Action for Mental Health, and I did some work around connection between mental health and the climate crisis. Yeah, the access to green spaces is so important, and that's such a really valuable resource that you just shared. It's certainly something I'll pick up and look at forward in our working groups. Thank you so much.
Fiona's kind of mentioned there is also what I was going to ask Chloe, is that we know that there's quite a significant body of evidence, particularly I'm more familiar with Highland than what evidence there is in Orkney and Shetland, but we know that there's quite a significant body of evidence of the kind of challenges that are being faced in these rural communities through things like our community planning partnerships. I know that Caithness and Sutherland both have quite a significant body of evidence in terms of that fuel poverty impacts on mental health. And I wonder, is there ways that we can feed that kind of evidence into the Poverty Alliance to try and amplify the voices of our rural communities?
Yeah, I think that would be really, really valuable. And I can share with you the contacts for our TARP team, and particularly our policy officer, Ralph. I'll make a note to share their contact details. They're really keen. Our work in TARP focuses on Argyll and Bute and Aberdeenshire as our sort of two local authority areas, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to hear all rural and island experiences, and it's important that we capture the real diversity of those experiences in our work on rural poverty. So yeah, please, I'll send our those contact details over, and they would be really grateful, I think, to hear those experiences.
That's good. I think there's a lot of evidence, from fuel poverty to transport to housing to food. Yeah.
I'll flag just because I have Ralph's voice in my ear that we're the Secretariat for the cross-party group on poverty in the Scottish Parliament, and our latest body of work was an inquiry into rural poverty in Scotland, and I can certainly share that report with you that highlights exactly the themes that you just said as being, key challenges for all people living in rural communities, but these are challenges massively amplified by those living in poverty and low income. And yeah, I think the key message from that is that policymakers often don't think about the rural premium when they're making policy, and the difficulty in accessing support in rural areas, which makes access to things like childcare and transport and food costs, unaffordable and unattainable for so many people. I can share that as well if that's helpful.
Yeah, that would be perfect. Thank you, Chloe. Yeah, I think for some of our rural areas it's not just the fact that there's very large issues as well, in that sometimes it's not just that things are unaffordable, it's that things are non-existent. That's also a very key issue. I was quite stunned a couple of months ago when I found out that on Skye, for example, it's not even the case of being able to afford a childminder for childcare. There literally aren't any childminders. Like, that's just doesn't exist. And yeah, we can certainly see similar issues to that in other areas of Highland. Does anybody else have any questions?
I would have one more, but I appreciate I've already asked a lot, so
No,
we can
you're
move
fine,
on.
Catherine.
You sure?
No,
Okay.
you're fine. Go ahead. Yeah.
So my background is in psychology, and I did a little bit of research during my studies around, how does psychology affect essentially consumerism and materialism? And there's a really interesting theory called theory of conspicuous consumption, where essentially once your basic necessities are met, and I know that's not the case for everybody, but once those are met, what we start to buy for and consume for is to gain social status. And that is often presented as a key driver of the overconsumption we see as part of the climate crisis. Right. So with that theory in mind, something I sometimes wonder, if we enabled everybody to have enough or have more than enough, ideally, sometimes I worry that with I'm going to use the bad C word, with the capitalist system that we're in, that really wants people to consume more and wants to grow, that we, without proper education around what makes you happy, what makes you fulfilled. I have seen this in communities as well. I worked as a community development worker in Glasgow in a deprived area before. Sometimes people get enough income, they get more money, they can meet their basic necessities, and then they spend above that on things that they don't actually really need or that are actually unhealthy for them. And sometimes I'm like, do you see that at all ever as a risk of, increasing poverty without challenging the norms that we have in our current system? It's a very big picture question, but I think about that sometimes, and I wondered if you had any thoughts.
I'm not sure I have any thoughts with my Poverty Alliance hat on. I think just because we've not maybe unpicked that enough, and it's certainly not been reflected in our sort of lived experience work or it's certainly not come up as a theme in our lived experience work. Although I can certainly with my kind of more climate activisty hat on, understand the sort of core of the question and sort of challenging the kind of core drivers of the climate crisis through the kind of exploitative systems we have in place. But yeah, it's something definitely that we'll need to think about as we develop our work. But I'm not confident I can say too much with the Poverty Alliance hat on. Sorry, that was a non-answer.
No, that's okay. And I think one of the things that make me think about that, I lived in Central America when I was 18 for like a cultural exchange type thing. And something I saw there was people, people didn't have furniture for their living room, but they had two phones. So just like the priorities of spending sometimes are shifted to things that we are being told we need, because, economy wants to grow, but do we really need them? And I think maybe it comes back to what Fiona said as well, to that connectedness to nature and that like really grounding in the present and all of these mental health aspects. So sometimes I wonder, yeah, if that's something that we need to address when we look at poverty and climate change as a connected issue.
No, for sure. I think that's a really interesting point.
I think sometimes as well, Catherine, it's about relative poverty. Your example there of being in Central America reminds me of, I remember quite a number of years ago now, pre-COVID, everything seems to, in my mind, seems to go pre-COVID and post-COVID, being an event, a poverty event in Inverness, which was around food poverty, that kind of gathered various people from around the third sector. My background is before I was managing the Climate Hub, I was managing a development trust up in Thurso. And there was somebody who spoke there who had done missionary work in Central America back in the 1960s, 1970s, and had recently returned. And his experience was that when he was out there in the 60s and 70s, some of these kind of villages that they went to, people were quite happily living from the land. They weren't interested in any of the modern technologies. They were probably in certain, some of these very small communities and villages were actually just being discovered at that kind of time that he was doing that missionary work. And then he went back just a few years ago and went to visit some of these communities, and like they would have considered themselves in the 60s and 70s, they would have considered themselves rich from what they were living from the land and how their culture was and how their community was. But then going back a few years and this new millennia would now consider themselves poor because they don't have a television, because they don't have this, and that there is that thing around relative poverty. And I think that it's something that we actually do see quite a lot in rural areas as well, is that you can very easily, like I can even name it on the street that I am in at the moment, is that there are people who significantly have, who are your next door neighbours to somebody who really doesn't have. And these very rural, small communities, it does have quite a significant psychological impact, because you then are even more isolated and being able to take part in your community in many ways. And again, that accessing of help, any of those things, it makes it much more significantly different, and yeah, has a massive psychological impact. Sorry, I'm not sharing this very well because I do see that we have a question in the chat. So Beric, who's from Kansas State University, very much welcome, wanted to ask if there was an example environmental injustice towards minorities in Scotland. You might need to just clarify that question a little bit more, Beric.
I'm happy to give it a wee go.
Okay.
Because I think that if I'm thinking from a poverty angle, there are communities in Scotland who are made more at risk of poverty, and that includes people from Black and minority ethnic communities. And if we're to think about the disproportionate impacts of the climate crisis on communities in poverty, there are certain groups that are overrepresented in the population that are living in poverty in Scotland. I can't think of any clear examples of specific climate injustices that Black and minority ethnic people have experienced in Scotland. But I think if I'm thinking just from a poverty lens, and from our experiences in our citizens panel, that the idea that through systems of bias and social injustice. People have been made more at risk of poverty. They in turn are being made more at risk of the impacts of the climate emergency.
Thanks, Chloe. Oh, I've actually just realised that he wasn't still on the call. So. Thanks for joining us again, Burke. We had just picked up on your question that you had in the chat. And I don't know if, Chloe, if you want to kind of briefly answer it again, but I was also just kind of mulling it over a little bit more. And I was thinking about maybe in the States where we have, I have forgotten the name of the city now, where there has been, there's definitely issues with water, and that has affected people disproportionately, which is an environmental issue. But I can't think of, I'm going to let Chloe answer the question again because you've rejoined the call, and try and have a think if there is anything that's a specific environmental injustice. But I think that we're probably talking about more poverty injustices.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, Joan. Right, just to briefly summarise what I'd said before, is that in Scotland there's evidence that patterns of poverty run through existing patterns of social injustice, and that people in Black and minority ethnic communities are made more at risk of poverty through things like bias, racial discrimination, and through existing social injustices, and that in turn makes those communities more vulnerable to the impacts of the climate crisis. I can't think, however, of any sort of specific examples of environmental injustices towards minorities in Scotland, but just sort of that overarching kind of theme that poverty makes you more at risk of harm by climate breakdown, and that you're more at risk of poverty, or you're made more at risk of poverty if you belong to certain groups, which includes whether you're disabled, if you're a woman, if you're Black and minority ethnic person, and that is through systemic and political failures and problems and challenges that we need to address if we're to address the climate emergency also.
Thanks, Chloe. And thank you, Beric, because it was Flint that I was thinking of, and the place just completely escaped me. I think where we would see more in communities is that, so communities who are maybe disempowered, who are empowered in the same way, that they don't have the same voice into things like policy, and I mean at that very, very local level. So if we think, and I don't think that it's environmental injustices against probably specific minorities, but there is probably small examples of, I'm thinking about things like in terms of air pollution, maybe communities don't have the voice to be able to share into consultation about where traffic congestion is and those kind of, but it's very, very much on the micro level rather than on that kind of larger level. Does anybody else have any questions? I'll just give a quick second for the chat. I can't see anybody typing. So I think that leaves us to thank Chloe. I know that we are coming to the end of Challenge Poverty Week. We have been, Ashley has very well been putting out on our socials all week the different aspects that where kind of what our work does as the Climate Hub and where the Poverty Alliance, where those sort of things merge. We are very keen to support Challenge Poverty Week every year. We have done so in the past, and very much support the work of the Poverty Alliance 365 days a year. I know that you can join as members of the Poverty Alliance. We are members of the Poverty Alliance, so that might be something that you might want to think about doing as your organisation. And we certainly get through lots of invitations, and there are a lot of events and things that you can contribute to. to amplify the voices of the people that are in your communities. I think that we'd probably very much like to follow up, Chloe, with providing some of that evidence that we have, which we know that exists in Highland. And I think that is probably us for today, other than to say thank you again very much to Chloe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We will also make the recording available and we will send that out. And Chloe, would you be able to make your slides available to us as well? That would be amazing. Yeah, that would be perfect. So we will send them out as a follow-up as well. Okay.
Thanks.
Thanks all.
Thank you so much.